Welcome back. In international news, after a day of peaceful protests across the United States following the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis earlier this week, a night of rage in America. Chaos ensued in several cities from the East Coast through to the Midwest to the West Coast of the country as tens of thousands clashed with law enforcement to express their anger, leaving destruction in their wake. Mayors in 24 cities imposed curfews. The first time so many locations issued similar orders since 1968 in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination. Around 1,500 arrests have taken place across the country, and as Sherwin Bryce-Pease reports, at least 3 states have activated the National Guard. Tense standoffs, often leading to clashes with police, were seen in cities across the country. In Minneapolis, where George Floyd died after a police officer pressed a knee on the back of his neck in this now famous video, a city resembling a war zone, buildings razed to the ground, stores ransacked and looted as protesters vent their anger over years of police abuse directed at minority communities. In Washington, the National Guard was deployed outside of the White House. In New York, pockets of protests around the city's different boroughs saw police overwhelmed as trash dumpsters were set alight while they tried to clear the streets, making multiple arrests. Police patrol vehicles, a regular target in multiple locations, smashed and set alight. All of this overshadowing a lurking pandemic in a country worst affected by COVID-19. Social distancing gone, crowds amassing together as public health officials shudder at the ramifications. We're joined now by SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's been monitoring the protests around the country. He joins us from New York. Sherwin, just as I was reading that line, I saw a tweet earlier on saying, raise your hands if you're unable to join the protest because of social distancing. And I must say, I wasn't sure if it was tongue-in-cheek, but just how many people are responding to this call, and not voluntarily, but because of this inane anger that this has become the norm.
It's an inane anger, Tsepiso, that I think has overwhelmed any sentiment around this public health emergency that has seen people remain under stay-at-home orders and lockdowns for about 3 months. That's all gone to pot, essentially, after the horrific death of George Floyd in Minneapolis last week. Tens of thousands have taken to the streets across these United States. You mentioned from the East Coast to the West Coast. I'll just name some cities: New York City, Houston, Texas, Miami, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, Chicago, Illinois, Los Angeles, California, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the list goes on. And I think in many instances, police really overwhelmed by the volume of people that you are seeing on the streets, people that have a visceral anger towards police officers on the streets, whether guilty or not in this instance. But it also speaks to the legacy of pain that people are now confronting, whether police or those that are confronting police violence against black minorities, black male individuals in particular. And that's what you are seeing, a built-up anger from the 1990s, the death of Rodney King. Remember the LA riots in 1990 in Los Angeles, to George Floyd in 2020. And what you are now hearing from people is really coming to terms with the lack of justice that we have seen perpetrated against black people. Officers are not always held account. There was an instance in 2012 in New York, the death of Romilly Graham inside his own apartment in the Bronx, shot by a police officer, Tsepiso, who was then charged with manslaughter, but those charges eventually dropped, leading eventually to the officer resigning. His mother, the mother of that victim, her name is Constance Malcolm. She spoke at one of the peaceful protests in the city in Brooklyn overnight. And then we'll also hear from a community activist and an Atlanta-based DJ who spoke out against the violence a few days ago.
Now, Sherwin, the arrest and charging of Derek Chauvin doing very little to quell the anger. I see many people saying that the other officers have not been arrested. What's the latest?
Yeah, I was just actually hoping that we would play the clips of those individuals that I was referring to really give us a sense, Tsepiso, of the the pain that people are feeling, but also hitting back at the distraction that some of these looting incidents and violence are creating. Could we play those now?
Charges don't mean anything until one of those people are in jail doing serious time. And I'm not talking about a slap on the wrist. 25 years, hard time in federal prison. That's the only way they're going to understand. We've been fighting for so long. We saw our ancestors came a long way for us to have voters' rights. We came a long way. We're going to continue to fight until we get justice.
I'm mad as hell. I woke up wanting to see the world burn down yesterday because I'm tired of seeing black men die. He casually put his knee on a human being's neck for 9 minutes as he died like a zebra in the clutch of a lion's jaw. And we watch it like murder porn over and over again. So that's why children are burning to the ground. They don't know what else to do. And it is the responsibility of us to make this better right now. We don't want to see one officer charged. We want to see 4 officers prosecuted and sentenced. We don't want to see targets burning. We want to see the system that sets up for systemic racism burnt to the ground.
What we are hearing from authorities, particularly in the Minneapolis case, is we've got the third-degree murder and manslaughter charge against Derek Chauvin, the police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck. But the real concern now is what's going to happen to the 3 bystanding police officers that were involved in that arrest but did nothing to stop their partner, their colleague, who was literally draining the life out of George Floyd. So really people seeking justice, and real concern here that the violence and the chaos you are seeing on the streets is taking away from those that are peacefully seeking justice for these crimes against the black community.
Really powerful imagery there showing the use of that word murder porn, and you juxtapose that against what officials are saying, calling people agitators, saying that this is not the right way to protest amidst such anger, which obviously has been bubbling over for a long time. You also have President Donald Trump as well threatening to call his dogs of war on people and say that he won't tolerate mob violence. What is the reaction to all of this?
Well, there's a great deal of concern that, as you hear the rhetoric from the White House and certainly from the executive, we also heard from the Attorney General William Barr denouncing what they believe is the infiltration of peaceful protests by some left-wing radical groups, including a group known as Antifa, a militant left-wing anti-fascist political activist movement, which President Trump has just tweeted about, Tsepiso, saying that they want to designate this a domestic agitating group a terrorist organization. It's unclear what kind of statute the president is referring to in terms of the ability to designate a domestic group a terrorist organization. There are statutes that exist in terms of designating foreign groups, so it's unclear how the president is actually going to implement the tweet he's referring to in terms of labeling this group a terrorist group. But there are also, you hear from security experts who are saying that there are white supremacist groups that have infiltrated these peaceful protests to agitate, to create violence, to loot, to give the impression that these are just thugs on the street without a cause. And so that's the dynamic that's playing out here. This will take clear law enforcement analysis, intelligence in terms of who are the disruptors here. And the big concern here is that everyone is being painted with the same brush. If you look at how these protests have developed, during the day they are peaceful, they are people that are talking, they are protesting, they have legitimate concerns. But as the sun sets, so the temperature changes, and so projectiles are launched and police vehicles are torched. And you saw the imagery of the CNN headquarters in Atlanta being trashed, windows being smashed. And that really is taking away from what is a legitimate concern here, a legacy frequency of brutality imposed by the police on particularly black males, young males in this country.
So, Sherwin, we understand President Trump spoke to the family of George Floyd. His brother Philonise taking to social media to say that it wasn't so much as a conversation. He feels that he was bamboozled by the president. He didn't get an opportunity to say anything. And I've seen many tweets, cartoons coming up in response to this, that it was just all about the president and the fact that he wanted to say he spoke to the family. Has he responded to that?
He has responded. I mean, the president spoke about, the fact that this is a nation that grieves with the Floyd family, his family. The president did make that call and did pass on the condolences here. But it's also juxtaposed with the other rhetoric, labeling the protesters thugs, the lack of empathy that this president over a long period of time has shown with victims of police brutality. This is also a very important electoral base for the president. Just remember when he ran in 2016, SABC, he was known as the law and order president. But what he is not is what Obama was referred to as the consoler in chief, particularly in the aftermath of the various gun violence incidents that punctuated various parts of his presidency. This is a president that lacks empathy. It's a president that lacks the ability to commiserate with people that are in pain. And that was also evidenced in the over 104,000 people that have died during this coronavirus pandemic. This is a president that feels he's done a great job in terms of the U.S. response in mitigating the spread of the virus, but there are people that are grieving, millions affected by the loss of life or by the infection rate that now is reaching almost 2 million in this country. A president that lacks empathy, that it tends to focus more on, his political capital and what this means for his re-election in 2020. So very difficult for him really to relate as George Floyd's brother testify to.
So just very quickly, Sherwin, obviously, as you said, there have been many voices who've had lots to say about this incident, but perhaps let's just go back to what William Barr was saying earlier on.
Unfortunately, with the rioting that is occurring in many of our cities around the country, the voices of peaceful protest are being hijacked by violent radical elements. Groups of outside radicals and agitators are exploiting the situation to pursue their own separate and violent agenda. In many places, it appears the violence is planned, organized, and driven by anarchic and left extremist groups, far left extremist groups, using Antifa-like tactics, many of whom travel from outside the state to promote the violence. We must have law and order on our streets and in our communities, and it is the responsibility of the local and state leadership in the first instance to halt this violence.
Sherwin,
Yes, also, go ahead, Sipiso.
No, I just wanted you to just speak to that, what William Barr was saying.
Well, there's an antithetical view to that it's not just the responsibility of the state and local authorities. Pretty much, the way we've been dealing with coronavirus, it's a collaboration between the local authorities and the federal government. And the concern here is that you have not heard a cohesive strategy from the federal level as to how we deal with questions of police brutality against black minorities in this country. You'll remember in 2014, President Obama appointed a commission, a task force to look at this issue, and they released a report in 2015 with a number of recommendations that various police jurisdictions around the country had to implement. The question is, to what extent have those recommendations been implemented, and to what extent can the new administration under President Donald Trump continue where the Obama administration left off? There is no real continuity on this issue, particularly as it relates to police brutality against these minority groups. Is a real concern. We try and answer the question, how do we ensure that tomorrow will be better than today? And that's an open question, Tsepiso.
Indeed, Sherwin, it's the George Floyd effect, as you say, many people around the world placing it in their own backgrounds on how it affects them, not only dealing with law enforcement officers, but the value of their lives. I saw a tweet earlier on putting that situation in the Middle East, saying it's not just in the United States, it's all over the globe. And that's something you, Sherwin, and the rest of us will continue to unpack. Thank you very much. SABC News correspondent in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Pease.